A man goes to the store, buys a dead chicken, has sex with the chicken, and then eats the chicken. What's wrong with this? Almost all women are weaker than almost all men. Hello there, everybody. This is Louise from Dostoevsky in Space, and today I'm so excited to bring you a review of my favorite book of the year so far of 2023, which is The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. Louise Perry is a radical feminist, which is different from a liberal feminist. She differentiates that very strongly throughout this book, and I love it. I don't agree with her about everything, but I'm actually shocked at how much I do agree with her on, and that's, I think, because she's going on the basis of so much research. Louise Perry wrote this really to her fellow feminists. Like, she grew up being a liberal feminist and just gradually over time realized that there were some really big problems that liberal feminism kind of glosses over or doesn't address directly enough to her satisfaction. And she kind of transitioned into radical feminism. Throughout this book, and I will talk about it, she differentiates her position as a radical feminist from positions of liberal feminism. And she also talks about where those two types of feminism coincide. The Case Against Sexual Revolution, the subtitle is A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century. I think she's really specifically writing it to young women because young women are the ones that she's concerned about in writing this. She's very concerned that young women are the ones who are bearing most of the harm of the sexual revolution. She is saying that along with the good came a whole host of bad things. And one of the main arguments that she's making in this book is that history is not one long arc of progress. That's an oversimplification. History comes with good and bad, and we make mistakes in every era. And she said there were a lot of mistakes that were made by liberal feminism in the last 70 years since the sexual revolution. She's writing this to women, trying to help women avoid getting hurt, for one thing. And she's also writing to young men, basically telling them how best to behave to women, because young men and young women have been raised in this current era to believe that there are no differences between the sexes, and she says that's untrue. So we'll get into the chapter description. So I'm going to do this review by chapter. There's 8 chapters in this book. I'm going to try to reduce it down because this video could go on for a really long time. I have so much to talk about in this video, but we just don't have all day. And you can also go listen to her actually talk rather than listening to me talk for an hour. But I'm going to talk about some of the things that really stood out to me. The foreword talks about how basically it's not wrong for women to have reservations about the current sexual marketplace. It's not wrong for women to have reservations about casual sex. Women should not feel pressured into casual sex, even if that's what the culture says is the feminist thing to do, and even if that's what the culture says is best for everybody. It's really not best for everybody. And so she tries to tell women in this book, basically, go with your gut instincts. If your gut instinct about a guy says, I don't want to be alone with him and having sex with him because he's stronger than I am, and I don't want to be put into a situation where I feel pressured to do anything I don't want to, things like that. She's like, listen to your instincts. Don't go back to his house on the first date. You know, that kind of stuff. It's just like, there's some common sense stuff in this guide, really for young women who've been raised without that kind of common sense kind of stuff. Because again, it's young women who are suffering the result of our current sexual marketplace. She wanted to emphasize that young women who do not want to have casual sex after the first date or even in the first 3 months of a relationship, they are not prudes, they're not frigid, they're not asexual, and they're not in moral panic. They're just doing what's best for them. And they don't even need to be religious. You don't need to be religious to also come to these conclusions. She's not religious. Louise Perry is an atheist. She came to these conclusions after long, hard experience of being hurt in the casual sex marketplace. Chapter 1 is called Sex Must Be Taken Seriously, which obviously you can understand why that would be unpopular. She talks quite a bit in this book about the sexual disenchantment, which is the disconnection of sex from anything moral or sacred or special. Basically, sexual disenchantment is what our culture believes right now, which is that there is nothing special about sex at all. there are contradictions in this argument. For example, we treat rape as a special class of crime, right? Back to sex, it's something that women cannot often treat casually, even if they try. They often find that it's very difficult to treat it casually, and we instinctively know this. Like in the workplace, if your boss asks you for a blowjob in order to advance your career, it's like quid pro quo. We know that that's wrong. We know inside of us there's an instinct that flees from that. We know that it's wrong. It's not the same thing as the boss asking you to go make him a coffee. So we know that there is something special about sex. And our current culture would have you believe that casual sex is just fun, and it only has the meaning that you put on it. We can't help putting meaning into it, basically. I mean, some people can, but there's like a sizable majority of females who cannot, and that's something she talks about in this book. The sociosexuality gap. Sociosexuality is the trait where you want sexual variety, so sex with lots of different people, changing partners often. Men tend to be much higher and women tend to be much lower. Most people are somewhere in the middle, but when you look at like the spectrum of like the people who are really high in sociosexuality, almost all of them are men. The people who are really low in sociosexuality are almost all women. So that's where you see the differences. It's not really like an average thing. Average people are average on the sociosexuality scale. But when you look at the ends of this spectrum, you see that men are vastly populating the one end of the spectrum. Women are vastly populating the other end of the spectrum. So, but she does say in here multiple times that, you know, you can't just judge something based on gender. You cannot tell what somebody's preferences are. There are definitely women who are thriving in the casual sex marketplace and they love some casual sex. They are high in sociosexuality. That is totally true. So she makes that clear. It's just that a lot of women, for good reason, they do not want to put themselves in a position where they're having sex with somebody they barely know and going back to their house on the first date. So, and she makes clear again why that is so, and she uses an evolutionary basis to do so. And obviously, if you're religious, you have your own basis to do so. And that's, I think, really, really interesting where we line up so often. Her evolutionary basis often lines up with a religious idea. And I think that's why I ended up really vibing with her, and that I am a religious person. I'm a Christian, and she's not. So it was just really startling to me how much we actually agree on. Okay, let's move on. Basically, she makes the argument in this book that the modern sexual revolution has always benefited the Hugh Hefners of the world rather than the Marilyn Monroe, and she uses this example because Hugh Hefner had girlfriends all the way up into his 90s, kind of living a paradise, and eventually the world kind of was like, oh, he's a perverted old man. He was like the god of the sexual revolution. Like, he just got everything that he wanted. And in fact, when Marilyn Monroe died at a very young age, possibly by suicide, Hugh Hefner bought the space next to her in a cemetery so that he could lay next to her because he just really loved that image of sleeping next to Marilyn Monroe. That's just the example that she starts off the book with, and I thought it was a really powerful anecdotal evidence of what she is talking about in this book. So quotes of note from chapter 1, Sex Must Be Taken Seriously, is that in particular, today's female porn performers are far more likely than their peers to have been sexually abused as children, to have been in foster care, and to have been the victims of domestic violence as adults. All misfortunes that Monroe suffered too. So often people who end up in sex work, they're at the very vulnerable end of the scale of prostitutes. That's not the case for all sex workers, but most of the people who are talking about rights for sex workers and listen to sex workers and sex workers work too. These are mostly well-educated, English-speaking people who have a lot more kind of control over the situation. So Louise Perry will talk more about this as well. This is kind of, the first chapter lays out a lot of the things that she'll be talking about later on in the book, but she accepts the fact that men and women are different and that these differences aren't going away. How can we promote the well-being of both men and women, even though their interests and needs are different? She also talks quite a bit in this book about chronological snobbery, which is the belief that, again, history, everything in the past was bad and evil, and there wasn't good reasons for all of the traditions that people followed in the past, and that the future is all bright and progressive and we're doing everything right. She's basically saying we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Traditions are sometimes there for a reason, and people who are older are not less wise than young people who have less experience, right? Sometimes with age comes experience and wisdom. Liberal ideology flatters us by telling us that our desires are good and that we can find meaning in satisfying them no matter the cost. But the lie of this flattery should be obvious to anyone who has ever realized the fact that they were wrong to desire something and hurt themselves or hurt other people in pursuing it. That's from page 20. So that's kind of an introduction of some of the topics. Chapter 2 is called Men and Women Are Different. All of these chapter titles are like kind of inflammatory, I guess, in today's marketplace of ideas. I'm using that word a lot here today, but I think that's because our culture is very like liberal feminist at the moment, and so she's kind of criticizing that. Even though she doesn't think it's all bad, there's a lot of things that she wants to talk about because they don't make sense to her as a feminist. This chapter talks a lot about socialization theory, and socialization theory is basically that the differences between men and women are all because of socialization and not because of any innate differences. But there's a particular study called A Natural History of Rape by Randy Thornhill and Craig T. Palmer, which she's like, this is not a book that feminists are supposed to like, but basically it's a study talking about how rape is probably an aggressive expression of sexual desire, but just because it's natural to some men to aggressively express their sexuality against women does not mean that it's right. And that's what the trap that a lot of feminists fall into when they read research like that study. The naturalistic fallacy is the false belief that because something is natural, it must necessarily be good. She's like, that's not true. So just because it might come natural to some men, that doesn't mean it's good. One of her later chapters is that not all desires are good. So she talks a lot about repression in this book, a lot about repressing certain sexual desires for the good of society and for the good of specific women, because some men just really do need to repress themselves. Perry cites examples of people who have, like in Me Too situations, forced women to have sex who really didn't want to, or like pedophilic adjacent type desires. Things like that need to be repressed. However, this obviously runs contrary to what the sexual revolution generally presents to the world about sexual repression. Basically, that sexual repression will damage you. Radical feminists, in contrast to liberal feminists, have no problem acknowledging that men and women have physical differences. Almost all women are weaker than almost all men. Like, she cites some studies here that are really interesting. So, for example, adult women are approximately half as strong as adult men in the upper body and 2/3 as strong in the lower body. In hand grip strength, 90% of females produce less force than 95% of males. There are obviously outliers because it's not 100% of females are weaker than 100% of males. But I mean, 90 and 95% those are pretty high numbers, right? But men can also run faster than women. The United States women's national football team in 2017 were beaten by the Dallas under-15 boys team, composed of boys who had just crossed the crucial puberty line and so had begun to develop the strength and power of adult men. So it's just like super obvious to people in sports that men are stronger and faster than women. That's just how it is as a general rule, which is why the women's category in sports has traditionally been protected, because if men were allowed to compete against women, there would be no women's sports. But there also are some differences above the neck, not just bodily. And this is where radical feminists even have trouble agreeing to it. And that's because the differences between men and women have been used in misogynistic ways to make arguments that females are inferior to males. Throughout history and sciences, this still happens. So that's why a lot of feminists push back on the idea that there are psychological differences between men and women, but ignoring those differences will just hurt the majority of women, because the majority of women are different from the majority of men, and it's important to recognize what that means for us as women. People are not walking gender stereotypes, but the gender stereotypes are mostly valid. So the whole thrust of this chapter, Men and Women Are Different, is really she's trying to like use that knowledge to do something productive and worthwhile. And in this case, a lot of this book is aimed towards reducing incidences of female rape, because she worked in a rape crisis center and she saw how many young women, like I think that she said the mean age of rape victims of women is like 15. So it's really young women that she's concerned about here. She's trying to reduce the incidences of rape, and you have to be able to acknowledge the differences between men and women before you can do that. Because there's a lot that women can do to reduce certain types of rape. Obviously, not all rape will be helped by her advice. She talks specifically about marital rape and child rape, and I think there's another kind of rape that she mentions, like I think prison rape or something. Certain kinds of rape will not be reduced by this guide, but there's a lot of other kinds of rape that can be if women just know. But we haven't been taught these things, so it's impossible to know. And again, there's a reason why women haven't been taught some of the things that she talks about in this guide, and that's because feminists are also very sensitive to victim blaming. We don't want to be victim blaming people who've been raped because it's not their fault. It's the rapist's fault. But in order to protect themselves, there are some things that they can do that our culture just does not tell women. That's an area where she's saying, like, for the good of women, we really need to talk about these things. There are predatory men out there, and it's important to know how to avoid them and how to kind of limit their chances of getting at you. So in every part of the world, something in the region of 98 to 99% of convicted sex offenders are male. So it's like vastly a male crime. There are female offenders, but they're kind of usually in specific categories, like there's a man with them and they're doing it together. And women almost never assault strangers. So it's just men are the rapists, basically. Because prosecution rates for sexual crimes are like super, super low across the world, I forget exactly what she said, but I feel like it was like 1% or less of rapes actually get prosecuted. And because consent workshops only do so much, and she will talk about how consent is too low of a bar. That's something that she talks about in this book. And she's like, consent workshops don't really work anyway, because honestly, rapists don't care about what's legal, and they definitely don't care what feminists think. So they're just gonna do what they want. So I loved this quote from her, because she is clearly not coming at this from an idea of, slut shaming or victim blaming at all. She worked in a rape crisis center and she cares about these young women, and they're often very young women who just don't know this stuff yet. Older women tend to know these kinds of things. So my advice to young women has to be this: avoid putting yourself in a situation where you are alone with a man you don't know, or a man who gives you a bad feeling in your gut. He is almost certainly stronger and faster than you, which means the only thing standing between you and rape is that man's self-control. And she's saying this again because she doesn't believe that resocialization theory, which tries to teach rapists not to rape, really works. And so she's basically saying, we don't live in a perfect world, so women just are gonna have to be careful. Because behaviors like, for example, she quotes certain things, like if you're at a club, you have reduced awareness because you are on drugs or you're drunk, you're in high heels, so you have limited mobility, and you're not with your female friends anymore, or you're with men who that you just don't know that well. You're in a much worse case to like protect yourself or escape in case a man decides to rape you. Stuff like that. Okay, chapter 3, some desires are bad. This is where she's talking to men, pretty much. So she starts this chapter really engagingly with a bunch of really bizarre situations that she's quoting from research. A man goes to the store, buys a dead chicken, has sex with the chicken, and then eats the chicken. What's wrong with this? Liberals have a hard time saying exactly what's wrong with that, even though it gives them an icky feeling to think about doing something like that. So this is really interesting because she quoted actually G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton points out that the people who don't understand old taboos are the last people who should be abolishing or reforming them. There are taboos basically against certain sexual behaviors for a reason. They're there for a reason, they're not there for no reason at all. Sexual liberals have falsely assumed that with all such taboos removed, then we would all be liberated and capable of making entirely free choices about our sexual lives, sampling from a menu of delightful options made newly available by the sexual revolution. So she talks a lot in this chapter about the wrong side of history and people who've been on the wrong side of history according to our current narrative, were really right about certain things. And one of those things is pedophilia. We tend to celebrate people who seem to be ahead of their time because the narrative they believed in became the dominant narrative. So she cites in this the campaigner Mary Whitehouse as one of history's losers, in the sense that she railed against the permissive society, but she was one of the only people who cared about the sexual abuse of minors in an age when many leftist performers supported it as the next phase of the sexual revolution, liberating children who have sexual desires and have been restraining from indulging them by adults. Eventually, progressive joined her in her condemnation of child sexual abuse. Pedophilia is now condemned by liberals and conservatives alike. For liberals, the wall between licit and illicit sexual behavior is now built upon an emphasis of consent. However, that argument falls apart. What about adults dressing up as children? What about illustrations of children, sexual illustrations? Are these still pedophilic? Are they wrong, even though no children were harmed in the making of this, like, pedophilic anime, for example? An ethical system based solely on consent does not allow space for moral intuition, which puts liberals in an awkward position. So basically, she talks a lot in this chapter about how moral intuition is something that we should be listening to. It's there for a reason. And even if we can't necessarily cite a reason for why, you know, for example, porn performers dressing up as young, like, school children and putting pornography out there that is pedophilic is wrong because these adults are not children in and of themselves, it's still wrong because it's pedophilic. Liberals tend to think that conservatives concerned about pedophilia are on the wrong side of history about this, like everything else. And so this part was interesting for me because she was like, yeah, it's kind of hard to figure out a new sexual ethic. Like, we've been trying to do this for forever. We've always been talking about what's right and wrong and how to decide what's right and wrong. And, like, I think for religious people, it's pretty clear how to decide what's right and wrong. But if you're not religious, I understand where she's coming from, that that's maybe more difficult for you. But this is why it's nice to be a part of organized religion, because we kind of have some guidelines for these things built in. I'm going to put the book down just because my hand is getting tired. She says, consent is a very low bar, so our new modern sexual ethic needs to be more sophisticated than just consent. She says, there are a lot of sexual behaviors that are neither criminal nor good, and about which the consent framework has very little to say. And again, the pedophilic anxiety that she was talking about is one of those situations. And she talks about also in this book, I can't cover everything obviously, but she mentions certain, like, celebrities, for example, like Armie Hammer and Jimmy Savile, who really needed to control their sexual impulses because Armie Hammer was violent and abusive in the bedroom to women, and Savile did not repress his sexual interest in children, and so he abused many children as a result. Okay, next chapter, chapter 4, Loveless sex is not empowering. Feminists say that women must destroy the patriarchy by fucking men back, the way the stereotype has always been that men fuck a woman without a care for her wants or needs. That's how the media portrays it working out. Empowering and mostly okay for women. But if it's not okay, we teach men not to rape. In general, a hookup culture sacrifices the desires of most women for the men who are successful and attractive enough to keep a harem of women who tend to be attracted to the same men because those women want to marry up. Gay and lesbian cultures are good examples of how men and women differ in this way. Lesbians have very high rates of monogamy and low rates of casual sex. And gay men have low rates of monogamy and very high rates of casual sex because they don't have to deal with the inhibitions of females. And women, on average, tend to be naturally pickier about their sexual partners. And she talks about why this makes perfect sense evolutionarily, because women have to put out a lot more effort to carry on their genetics. And having a baby takes a huge toll on women and makes them very vulnerable. And also, female pleasure is really rare in casual sex. She quoted statistics about that, but I think I forgot to write them down. It was like, male pleasure was obviously prioritized in the casual sex marketplace, and also oral sex for men was prioritized, and oral sex on women was down. Hookup culture has been presented as liberating for women, but many women are deeply unhappy with casual sex without intimacy. I couldn't actually believe some of the things that she quoted, but she quoted articles that actually recommended taking cocaine or meth in order to dull your response in a sex, so that you could have casual sex without, like, bonding prematurely to your partner. And I will link the articles down below in case you want to look at it for yourselves. Also, this is an interesting thing that I didn't know. Men in anonymous surveys largely prefer a wife with limited sexual history. For casual sex, they don't mind women who have more experience, but for marriage, they prefer women who have less sexual experience. Women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men, so they have to really work hard on their priorities in a situation like this. And she advises women, don't be thinking, would this guy make a good boyfriend? Instead, think, would this guy make a good father to our children? If we were to have children, would he be a good father? That's what you want to be looking for. And women also need to know that the fact a man wants to have sex with you does not mean that he wants a relationship with you. And she'll talk about some other things like that too, like him wanting to commit violence against you, you know, in sexual encounters. That is not an indication of his actual loving care about you. Chapter 5, consent is not enough. The law has to rely on the arbitrary age of consent, even though we know that the transition from childhood to adulthood is not that quick and simple. And the porn industry and sex work rely on consent as well, which will only work as a legal defense. It doesn't really work as a moral defense. So she talks about porn stars a lot in this book, and how victims of grooming and abuse and ex-porn stars often have similar trajectories. They are deluded or coerced into publicly defending their abusers and the sex industry. But when they finally leave, they talk about the horrors they endured and the unhappiness that they were living with. And this was really interesting because I just watched, and I'm still continuously watching as new episodes come up, The Secrets of Playboy, and just the vast majority of women who are Playboy bunnies and who are interviewed in these shows, the vast majority of them express regret and kind of disgust about their time there. Not about every single thing, but about a lot of the stuff that they experienced. And they talk about having PTSD from their experiences at the Playboy Mansion. Even if they were very public defenders of that sort of lifestyle while they were there, they were really trying to protect Hef. And multiple ones of them talked about trying to protect Hugh Hefner. And did he really need protection? No, he did not. But that's how they felt, because that's how they were kind of groomed to feel. And she talks a lot in this chapter about consent is not enough. She talks about the crimes of MindGeek. MindGeek is a particular purveyor of pornography. She really criticizes heavily the porn industry in this book. She says, Pornhub knowingly hosts videos of children and sex trafficking victims being raped, as well as revenge porn shared without the victim's consent. MindGeek, the giant of the porn world, operates nearly 100 websites, including Pornhub. But Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas Kristof wrote a damning piece on Pornhub that couldn't be written off as merely conservative prudishness. Despite barely concealed malpractice, Pornhub continues to churn out material because people still flock to watch it, including the videos of coerced sex, child sexual abuse, and more. So yeah, basically she argues in this book that there's no reason to be watching porn. Nobody should ever need to watch it ever again. And there's really no way to tell if somebody is actually happy to be a porn performer, because she talks about Linda Lovelace, who is famous from Deep Throat, which was a really famous porn film. And at the time of the promotions for Deep Throat, she was very like a vocal advocate for what she was doing and saying she was having a good time with it and everything. But in reality, her husband was forcing her to do these things and beating her, and she was not doing this willingly. She was basically doing it so that her husband wouldn't kill her. And she's come out and said this, that anybody who is watching Deep Throat is watching me being raped. So you really just don't know what performers are going through when they're filming these things. Even if they're over the age of 18, even if they have consented, you just don't really know what their mental state is like. If you're watching revenge porn that a woman does not want to be out in the world, but her ex put it up there, stop doing that. A 2019 survey commissioned by the BBC found that 23% of UK men aged 18 to 15 reported not having watched porn in the last month. So not everyone is doing it. Dr. Fiona Vera Gray, a research fellow at Durham University, has conducted research with both men and women about their experiences of porn.
Many users, Vera Gray reports, have an ethical conflict going on in terms of seeing material that they feel is pretty shitty for women, but personally they're aroused by it. So they're masturbating to material, and then afterwards they think, oh my god, and push the computer away.
This portion of the chapter is about limbic capitalism, which is basically about how porn users are kind of roped into watching this stuff. Porn is to sex as McDonald's is to food, and sex robots will further the problem. Men who watch porn, regardless of the amount, are sometimes causing permanent sexual impairment, with erectile dysfunction now affecting between 14 and 35% of young men, in contrast to perhaps 2 or 3% at the beginning of this century, and impotence, death grip syndrome. So really the only concern of the people who are perpetuating the porn industry is profits. They're doing it for the profits, so if people stop watching, they will stop making it. It does not have a concern for sex workers, and it does not have a concern for the consumers. Porn is bad for everybody involved. Chapter 6 is Violence is Not Love. In this chapter, she goes off on 50 Shades, so sorry if you're a 50 Shades fan. Christian Grey's behavior towards Anastasia is common or garden domestic abuse. A small minority of women find it attractive, but their reasoning is flawed. So women who like Christian Grey and BDSM kind of assume that if a man gets violent in the expression of his feelings towards you, it must mean that he cares deeply about you. But Theodore Dalrymple describes what a jealous man is really like. All ego, not faithful at all. And in romance novels, women as a whole find faithfulness attractive, which makes sense considering the vulnerability of the pregnant and nursing conditions. More traditional romance novels also tell us that women are never attracted to a man who plays hard to get or who is distracted by the attentions of other women. Honestly, this is so evident to me by everybody in the world's reaction to Edmund in Mansfield Park. I didn't have this reaction, and I think it was because I read Mansfield Park when I was so much younger. I never remember having a bad reaction to Edmund, but it seems like everybody else in the world who's read Mansfield Park is like, ew, Edmund. And it's because he has this attraction for another woman when Fanny is right in front of him. Also, there's a lie out there that BDSM is subverting people's natural instincts, but that's actually not true. People who are doms in real life are usually not subs in BDSM. They're also usually doms in the bedroom. And people who are subs in real life are also usually subs in BDSM. So it doesn't usually switch roles, which is something that has been said to defend BDSM. A 2013 study of participants in a BDSM online forum found that only 34% of men consistently preferred the sub position, while an even smaller proportion of women, 8%, identified as doms. So I also wanted to mention here that I was looking for the study because I forgot to actually check it out in the back of the book. But there's a bunch, when I Googled it, there's a bunch of articles being like, oh, BDSM participants have better mental health, study says. But if you actually look at the study, it says that mainly DOMs have better mental health. And as Louise Perry talks about, men are usually the DOMs. Women are like usually the subs. Like I think she said 8% of women are DOMs. Not great for women. Feminists have sometimes even venerated the Marquis de Sade, the French aristocrat for whom sadism is named. All of these eminent defenders of Sade know full well what he got up to in real life. The fact that he imprisoned, raped, and tortured many prostituted women and servants, including several children, and these victims most certainly did not consent to what was done to them. If he hadn't been imprisoned, he would likely have escalated to murder. And of all the sex acts associated with BDSM, strangulation is currently the most fashionable and also the most gendered. It's almost always men doing the choking, and women never do it to themselves during masturbation. Outside of sex, choking is gendered in the same way. It's not surprising that women mistakenly interpret aggression as a sign of passion, with books like 50 Shades and Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist, and articles like A Men's Health Piece, which talks about how to safely incorporate breath play or strangulation into your sex life. But not only is that not true, strangulation can never be done safely. An alarming study from 2020 reveals a wide range of injuries that can be caused by non-fatal strangulation and reports that not all of these injuries may be visible to the naked eye or visible right away. Although it can take several minutes to actually kill someone by strangulation, unconsciousness or choking out can occur within seconds and always indicates at least a mild brain injury. The layman probably isn't familiar with these facts, so they really can't give an informed consent. We can't consent to this. The feminist appeal to consent cannot convincingly explain why a woman who hurts herself should be understood as mentally ill, but a woman who asks her partner to hurt her is apparently exercising her sexual agency. Well, guys, my camera keeps cutting me off, and I've been talking for over an hour, and I'm actually losing my voice, so I didn't quite finish everything I wanted to get through. There's actually 2 more chapters. Chapter 7, which is People Are Not Products, and Chapter 8, which is Marriage is Good, but I'll just have to leave those out for this review. But I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know down below if you have any thoughts, and I'll talk to you soon.